The town had been built with straight lines and stubborn pride, every house facing the road as if daring winter to test it. Timber frames rose one by one, fresh-cut wood still smelling green, nails hammered in with confidence that bordered on arrogance. People believed that if something looked solid enough, it would be. That belief was so deeply rooted that no one questioned it anymore, no one except her. She stood at the edge of town, not looking at the road or the neat rows of houses, but at the low hillside beyond them. Where others saw useless ground and stone, she saw shelter. She had lived through enough winters to know how cruel they were. She remembered nights when the wind screamed through gaps in the walls, when frost crept across the inside of the windows like a living thing. She remembered waking up to ice in the wash basin, her breath thick and white even under blankets. She remembered how wood stoves burned non-stop yet never quite won, how the heat fled upward and outward as fast as it was made. The houses looked strong in summer, proud and upright, but winter exposed their weakness every time. Timber shrank, joints loosened, wind found its way in. Cold always did, so when she chose the hillside, the laughter began immediately. People stopped in the street to watch as she marked the earth with stakes and string, measuring not width or height, but depth. Men leaned on fence posts and shook their heads. Women whispered behind gloved hands. A house was supposed to rise toward the sky, not disappear into the ground. What she was planning looked backward, primitive, even shameful. Someone called it an animal hole. Someone else said she must be desperate. A cave, they agreed, was not a home. She heard them all. She simply did not answer. The earth at the base of the hill was frozen hard when she first struck it, the soil resisting the shovel like iron. Each blow sent a jolt through her arms, but she worked steadily, breaking the surface inch by inch. She dug where the slope curved naturally inward, choosing a place where the land already offered protection from wind. She had watched how snow drifted there, how storms passed overhead without scouring the ground bare. She trusted what the land showed her more than what people said. As the days passed, the hole deepened. Dirt piled up beside her in uneven mounds. Her hands blistered, then hardened. She worked in silence while townspeople came and went, offering commentary instead of help. They asked why she didn't just build like everyone else. They asked if she wasn't afraid of collapse, of darkness, of being buried alive. One man laughed and said she would never finish before winter came. Another said she would regret it the first time it rained. What they didn't understand was that she wasn't rushing. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was building for endurance, not appearances. Every scoop of earth removed was deliberate. Every stone uncovered was examined, sometimes kept, sometimes discarded. She paid attention to how the soil changed color and texture, how it held together or crumbled. The earth told her where it was strong and where it needed support. When the cavity reached deep enough to stand in, the sound changed. The wind faded, the noise of the town dulled. Inside the hillside, there was a quiet she had never known in a frame house. It was not empty. Silence, but something heavier, steadier. Even unfinished, the space felt protected. She reinforced the entrance with salvaged beams, wood pulled from old fencing and abandoned sheds. She set them carefully, angling them so the weight of the hill pressed down instead of in. Where gaps appeared, she filled them with clay, pressing it in by hand, smoothing it until the surface became continuous. She mixed soil and straw the way she'd seen done once years ago, creating a seal that hardened as it dried. The work was slow and exhausting, but each finished section felt permanent in a way nailed boards never did. People continued to mock her choice. They said she was wasting time, that a proper house could be thrown up in weeks. They said she was isolating herself, hiding away like a hermit. But she noticed something they didn't. Even on cold mornings, the ground inside the dugout wasn't icy. The earth held a steady chill, not the biting cold of open air. When the sun set early and frost coated the grass, the interior remained unchanged. At night, when she rested, she lay on the packed earth floor and listened. There was no creaking, no snapping wood, no whistle of wind forcing its way through seams. The hill absorbed sound the way it absorbed cold, leaving behind a deep, reassuring stillness. It felt less like hiding, and more like being held. She thought of the winters ahead, not just the next one, but all of them. Timber would always age, nails would rust, boards would warp. Earth, on the other hand, had been standing against winter longer than any house ever built in that town. Hills didn't freeze solid, caves didn't shatter in storms. The ground understood cold in a way humans never would. As she shaped the interior, she kept the ceiling low, not out of fear but intention. Warmth rises, and she had no desire to heat empty space. The walls curved naturally, no sharp corners for cold to gather in. She planned the placement of the stove so its heat would radiate into the earth itself, letting the walls store warmth instead of letting it escape. Everything served a purpose. Nothing was decorative. Still, the town judged what it could see. From the outside it looked unfinished, even crude. A dark opening in a hill did not signal comfort or safety to people who measured success by height and visibility. Children dared each other to run past it. Adults shook their heads and muttered about foolishness. No one imagined they might be wrong. She did not defend herself. Experience had taught her that survival arguments only made sense after survival was proven. Words meant nothing against tradition. Results, however, had a way of changing minds. By the time the first real cold settled in, her hands were cracked and sore, her body worn down by weeks of labor. But the dugout was ready, not perfect, not polished, but solid. The entrance faced away from the worst winds, the walls were sealed. The floor was dry. When she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the temperature barely shifted. Outside, frost glittered on the ground. Inside, the air felt calm, almost mild. She lit the stove for the first time and watched how the heat behaved. It didn't rush upward and vanish. It lingered, soaking into the walls, settling into the floor. Hours later, long after the fire had burned down, the warmth remained. She smiled then, not out of pride but relief. That night, as the wind howled across the open ground and rattled the timber houses in town, she slept deeply. The hill did not move. The earth did not complain. It simply did what it had always done, shielded what was inside it from what raged beyond. The town continued to laugh, unaware that the test was already underway, and that winter, as it always did, would soon deliver its verdict. The work grew harder once the initial excitement faded, and the reality of what she had chosen fully set in. Digging into the hillside was no longer a curiosity for the town, it had become background noise. But for her, each day demanded more strength than the last. The deeper she went, the heavier the earth felt, as if the hill itself was testing her resolve. Shovelfuls of damp soil clung stubbornly to the blade. Stones emerged unexpectedly, forcing her to stop, assess, and decide whether to work around them or wrestle them free. Her shoulders ached constantly, and her hands stayed raw despite wrapping them in cloth at night. She worked alone most days. Help had never been offered seriously, and she would not beg for it. Instead, she developed a rhythm: dig, lift, carry, dump. Dig, lift, carry, dump. The repetition became almost meditative. With every basket of earth hauled away, the interior space gained definition. What had begun as a rough cavity slowly turned into something that felt intentional. The walls smoothed under her hands as she pressed loose soil back into place, shaping it rather than fighting it. She learned which sections needed reinforcement and which could stand on their own. The hill taught her its limits. The townspeople still commented when they passed, but the tone had shifted slightly. The jokes were less sharp, replaced by a kind of disbelief that she was still at it. Some assumed she would quit once exhaustion caught up with her. Others believed the first rain would collapse everything she'd built. They had all seen shallow dugouts fail before, poorly planned holes that turned into muddy traps. They assumed hers would be no different. What they didn't see was the care she took with water. She carved shallow channels into the ground outside the entrance, guiding runoff away from the opening. She layered gravel beneath the packed earth floor so moisture had somewhere to go. Where the hill wept slightly after rain, she sealed it with clay mixed thick and dense, pressing it into cracks until the seepage stopped. She tested each section patiently, wading through storms before moving on. Every solution was earned through observation, not guesswork. As the interior expanded, the sound changed further. Each strike of the shovel echoed softly, absorbed by the surrounding earth. The space felt insulated not only from cold but from chaos. Even on days when the wind tore across the open fields, the air inside remained still. That stillness became addictive. She found herself lingering inside after work was done, sitting on an overturned crate, simply breathing. She began reinforcing the entrance more heavily as the opening took its final shape. Salvaged beams were set deep into the ground, angled and locked together so they formed a strong frame. She wedged smaller stones around their bases, tamping earth tight until nothing shifted under pressure. The entrance wasn't wide, but it didn't need to be. Smaller meant less exposure, less heat loss, less invitation for winter to force its way inside. Clay became her most valuable material. She collected it from a low spot near the creek, heavy and slick when wet, firm as stone when dry. She mixed it with chopped straw and soil, kneading it like bread dough until it reached the right consistency. Then she pressed it into seams, joints, and cracks, smoothing it with wet hands. The work left her coated in mud by the end of each day, but as the clay cured, the walls became dense and unified. No light slipped through, no drafts whispered along the surface. People laughed when they saw her covered head to toe in earth, said she looked more like part of the hill than a person. She let them laugh. She knew what the clay was doing. It was turning loose ground into a continuous shell. Wood expanded and contracted with weather. Clay and earth moved together, sealing themselves tighter as temperatures dropped. The colder it became, the stronger the walls would hold. Inside, the temperature difference was already noticeable. Even unfinished, the dugout did not match the air outside. On cool evenings, when frost settled over the fields, the interior stayed just above cold. Neither warm nor uncomfortable, simply stable. She could feel it in her bones. This was not a place that would panic when winter arrived. She laid the floor last, packing layers carefully. First gravel, then soil, then a final surface smoothed flat with a wooden board. It was firm underfoot, not dusty, not damp. When she stood still, the cold did not creep upward the way it did in frame houses with their raised floors and open crawl spaces. The ground beneath her acted as insulation rather than an enemy. The townspeople still burned through wood preparing their homes. Axes rang in the distance as trees fell and were split for firewood. Piles grew taller each week, stacked against houses like defensive walls. She split some wood too, but not with the same urgency. She needed far less than they did. The hill would do most of the work for her. As the dugout took its final form, she installed the stove, setting it against a reinforced section of wall where the heat could sink directly into the earth. She built the chimney carefully, sealing every joint, ensuring no smoke leaked into the space. When she lit the first fire to test it, she watched closely, noting how the warmth moved. It spread slowly, evenly, not rushing toward the ceiling but lingering at body level. The walls absorbed it like dry ground after rain. That night, when the fire burned low, she waited for the chill to return. It didn't. The warmth faded gently, leaving behind a comfortable coolness instead of biting cold. Hours later, the interior still felt livable. She ran her hand along the wall and felt stored heat beneath the surface. Outside, the town continued as it always had, confident in familiar methods. Houses stood proud and exposed, their straight lines cutting into the wind. No one believed the earth could outperform wood. No one believed something hidden could be stronger than something seen. She finished the final details quietly. Shelves carved into the wall, hooks set into beams, a heavy door fitted snugly into the entrance frame, sealed so tightly that when it closed, the outside world vanished completely. When she stepped back and looked at her work, there was no sense of triumph, only certainty. The Dugout cabin did not look impressive from the outside. It did not announce itself, but inside it felt finished, resolved, prepared. While others trusted nails and boards, she trusted weight, depth, and time. She trusted the same earth that had survived every winter before any of them arrived. As the first true cold wind of the season swept across the land, she stood at the entrance and watched it bend the grass flat. She closed the door, sealed off the sound, and felt the quiet return. Winter could come when it wanted. The hill was ready. Winter announced itself without ceremony, slipping in quietly at first, as if testing the land's readiness. The mornings came colder than expected, the frost lingering long after sunrise. Breath turned white sooner. Water skins stiffened overnight. In the town, people shrugged it off. Early cold was nothing new, they said. It would pass. It always did. Fires were lit a little earlier in the evenings. Coats pulled tighter, complaints exchanged casually in the street. No one thought much of it, except her. Inside the dugout, she noticed the difference immediately. The outside air dropped sharply overnight, but the interior barely changed. When she stepped inside after a long day of work, the familiar calm greeted her, steady and unbothered. The earth held its temperature like it held memory. It did not react to sudden shifts. It waited them out. She continued refining the interior as the days shortened. Small adjustments made all the difference now. She sealed a thin seam near the doorway where she felt the faintest whisper of air. She adjusted the stove's position slightly, angling it so heat traveled along the longest wall before dispersing. Each change was subtle, but she felt the results immediately. The space responded like a living thing, growing more efficient, more balanced. In the town, people began to notice their houses behaving differently. Wood shrank as temperatures dropped, opening gaps where none had existed weeks before. Wind found those gaps without effort. It whistled through corners, crept under doors, slid between boards. People stuffed rags into cracks, nailed extra strips of wood along seams, hung heavy blankets over doorways. Fires burned longer now, consuming wood faster than planned. She watched from a distance without comment. One evening, after a sharp drop in temperature, she stepped outside just after sunset. The cold bit immediately, sharp and aggressive. The wind cut across the open ground, unbroken by obstacles, slamming into houses head-on. Smoke poured from chimneys in thick streams, yet the windows glowed dimly, as if the warmth inside was already being stolen. She returned to her dugout and closed the door behind her. The silence was immediate. The cold stayed outside. She lit the stove once, not because she had to, but because she wanted to test it. The fire burned low and steady, its heat sinking into the walls. She cooked, moved around comfortably, then let the fire die down naturally. Hours later, as she lay resting, the warmth lingered. Not hot, not cold, just right. She slept without waking, something she had not done easily in winter for years. The next morning, ice coated the ground thick enough to crunch underfoot. In town, voices carried an edge now. People spoke louder, more urgently. Someone complained about frozen water buckets. Someone else mentioned a cracked window pane. A child cried from the shock of cold air inside their home. The laughter that once followed her through the streets was gone, replaced by distraction and denial. Still, no one came to her. She continued her routine calmly. She split a small amount of wood, far less than her neighbors, and stacked it neatly inside where it stayed dry. She adjusted the venting on the stove, learning exactly how little fire she needed to maintain comfort. The dugout responded predictably, almost generously. Heat in, heat stored, heat released slowly. No effort wasted. As winter deepened, the difference grew impossible to ignore. Nights plunged colder, faster. Frost no longer melted by midday. Snow fell and stayed. Frame houses groaned under the strain, wood popping sharply in the dark as temperatures dropped. Inside those homes, fires burned hard through the night, yet breath still fogged the air. People slept in layers, waking repeatedly to feed stoves that never seemed satisfied. In the dugout she woke rested. The earth walls did not sweat or crack. Moisture stayed controlled, absorbed naturally by the surrounding ground. The air inside remained still, heavy in a comforting way. There were no drafts, no sudden chills. Even the sounds of winter, wind, distant cracking trees, the howl of storms, were muted, softened by layers of soil and stone. The dugout did not fight the season, it ignored it. She noticed the town watching her more closely now. People lingered near the path that led past her hillside. Their eyes followed her movements, their conversations quieting when she passed. Curiosity replaced mockery, though pride kept it from turning into questions. They told themselves, her luck would run out, that a real cold snap would expose the weakness of her choice. Then the real cold came. The temperature dropped overnight to levels people had not prepared for. Zero came quickly, dragging everything below it. Wood stiffened and snapped. Metal burned bare skin on contact. Water froze solid where it stood. In the early hours of that morning, cries echoed through the town as doors refused to open, hinges locked in ice. Fires struggled against the invading cold, heat bleeding away faster than it could be produced. Inside her dugout, the temperature shifted barely a degree. She rose, lit the stove once more, and moved through her space with ease. Her breath did not fog. Her hands stayed warm. The walls felt solid, almost warm to the touch where stored heat lingered beneath the surface. The dugout behaved as it always had, steady, reliable, unbothered by extremes. Outside, panic began to replace denial. People gathered wood desperately, burning through reserves meant to last months. Furniture was broken apart for fuel. Curtains were nailed over windows. Families huddled together in single rooms, abandoning the rest of their houses to the cold. Even then the cold crept in relentlessly. She did not go out to prove a point, she did not invite anyone in. She waited. The earth had already proven her right. The town just hadn't admitted it yet. As the night deepened and the cold tightened its grip, she sat quietly inside her dugout, listening to the faint, distant sounds of struggle beyond the hill. The contrast was stark. Above ground, winter raged. Below it, she lived calmly, protected by the simplest truth of all, that the land itself was the strongest shelter anyone could build. By morning, the verdict would be undeniable. The cold did not arrive like a storm. It settled in like a decision already made. By the time the sun rose that morning, the land felt locked in place, every surface stiff and unyielding. Breath crystallized instantly. Snow no longer squeaked underfoot, it cracked. Even sound behaved differently, carrying farther, sharper, as if the air itself had hardened. In the town, people woke to houses that no longer obeyed them. Doors refused to open. Hinges were frozen solid, iron seized by cold so deep it felt permanent. Windows filmed over from the inside, frost crawling across the glass in thick, branching patterns. Fires that had burned faithfully for weeks now seemed weak, their heat vanishing the moment it left the stove. People fed them constantly, arms aching from splitting wood in temperatures that numbed fingers within minutes. Still the cold pushed inward, pressing through walls, floors, and ceilings as if the houses were no more than thin shells. Wood complained loudly. Sharp cracks echoed through the streets as beams shrank and stressed. Nails loosened with sudden pops. Somewhere, glass shattered. One clean, brittle sound followed by silence. Children cried not from hunger or fear they could name, but from the deep discomfort of cold that would not let go. Adults spoke in tight, clipped voices, trying to sound calm while counting how much fuel remained. At the edge of town, the hillside did not change. Inside the dugout, the morning felt almost ordinary. The air was cool but gentle, steady in a way that made time feel slower. She woke without the shock of cold, without the instinctive reach for blankets, or the frantic search for warmth. The walls held the night's heat, releasing it slowly, evenly. The floor beneath her feet was firm and dry, not biting, not slick with frost. She lit the stove out of habit more than necessity. The fire caught easily, the draft smooth and controlled. Heat spread in a calm, predictable way, sinking into the earth instead of racing upward and away. She brewed something warm and sat quietly, listening, not to the wind, which barely reached her, but to the faint vibrations carried through the ground. The hill muffled sound, but it could not erase it completely. Somewhere above, the town struggled. By midday, the truth could no longer be ignored. Frame houses that had looked solid in summer now betrayed their weaknesses openly. Frost formed along interior walls, thick enough to scrape away with a knife. Water froze in pipes, bursting them in places where insulation had failed. Livestock refused to move, breath heaving in clouds as owners dragged blankets and straw into stalls already glazed with ice. The smell of smoke grew heavy in the air as every stove burned at full effort. People began to move through the streets with urgency, faces wrapped in scarves, eyes darting. Pride was giving way to survival, and survival has a way of stripping away pretense quickly. They noticed then what they had avoided noticing before. Her hillside remained quiet. No smoke poured desperately from a chimney. No frantic movements surrounded the entrance. The door opened and closed occasionally, controlled, deliberate. The hill looked unchanged, indifferent to the chaos spreading through the town. That contrast unsettled people more than the cold itself. Someone said it out loud for the first time. "She's warm in there." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. At first, they dismissed it. Maybe she had more wood. Maybe she was suffering just as much, just not showing it. But as the hours passed and the cold tightened its grip, doubt grew harder to ignore. People were burning through fuel at an alarming rate. What had been stacked carefully for the winter dwindled fast. Axes rang out even in the worst of the cold as desperation overrode caution. Fingers bled, tools slipped. Still, the fires never seemed enough. By evening, the temperature dropped further. 0 no longer sounded extreme. It sounded merciful compared to what followed. Wind cut across the open ground like a blade, slamming into houses that offered no resistance. The cold did not creep in now. It invaded. Floors turned into ice. Beds felt like stone. Families abandoned upper rooms entirely, huddling together near stoves that glowed red-hot yet failed to warm the space beyond arm's reach. Inside the dugout, the shift was barely noticeable. She added a single piece of wood to the stove and watched the flames settle. The walls responded as they always did, absorbing, storing, holding. She moved freely, hands uncovered, breath slow and even. The silence felt deeper now, more pronounced, as if the earth itself was blocking out the world above. She did not feel smug. She felt vindicated in the quietest way possible. Not by being right, but by being prepared. Late that night, a knock came at her door. It was hesitant, almost apologetic, the sound muffled by layers of earth and wood. She paused, listening, making sure she had heard correctly. When the knock came, a guy. N. She rose and opened the door. 2 figures stood there, bundled heavily, faces red and stiff with cold. They did not joke. They did not laugh. They did not comment on her choice or her methods. One of them simply said, "We can't keep the house warm." She stepped aside without a word and let them in. The change hit them immediately. Shoulders dropped, breathing slowed, their eyes widened slightly, not in amazement, but relief so deep it bordered on disbelief. The air inside did not burn their lungs. The floor did not steal heat from their feet. The walls did not radiate cold. They stood there silently for a moment, absorbing what their bodies already understood. "It's steady," one of them said quietly. She nodded. That was the best word for it. They did not stay long. Pride still clung stubbornly, even in crisis. They asked questions instead. How deep, how thick, how much wood she burned. She answered simply, without embellishment. When they left, their footsteps outside sounded heavier, slower, weighed down by more than cold. By morning, more came. Not all at once, not in a crowd. One by one, pairs and small groups appeared at the entrance, faces drawn, eyes tired. Some asked for warmth, others asked for advice. A few simply stood and stared, trying to reconcile what they felt inside the dugout with what they believed about houses. Above ground, the night had been brutal. Several frame houses had failed completely. Roofs sagged under the combined weight of snow and frozen stress. Interior walls cracked. One house had to be abandoned when the stove overheated, trying to compensate, filling the space with smoke while the cold still won. People slept in shifts, feeding fire. Constantly, afraid to let them die even for an hour. Her dugout did not demand such vigilance. It did not punish rest. As the cold stretch dragged on, the difference grew starker. Fuel piles shrank dangerously low. People rationed heat, closing off rooms permanently. Livestock losses mounted. Fingers and toes went numb too often, too quickly. The cold seeped into bones and stayed there, making every movement harder. Inside the hill, time moved differently. The dugout maintained its quiet rhythm. Fire, rest, stored warmth, release. The earth did not care how low the temperature dropped outside. It existed on its own terms, governed by mass and depth rather than air and wind. The thicker the cold pressed from above, the more firmly the hill held what was inside. Eventually, no one laughed anymore. The comments that had once followed her through the town vanished entirely. In their place came something else, recognition. People began to talk openly about what had gone wrong, about how much heat they lost through walls and roofs, about how wind found every weakness, about how the ground beneath their houses offered no protection at all, only emptiness. They looked at the hillside differently now. What they had once dismissed as crude or desperate now looked deliberate, smart, even elegant in its own way. The dugout did not fight winter with brute force. It simply refused to engage with it. As the cold spell finally began to ease, leaving the town battered and exhausted, the lesson lingered. People stepped outside and felt the first hint of softening in the air, but they did not celebrate. They took stock instead, of broken boards, of empty woodpiles, of how close they had company. Me to losing more than comfort. She stood at her door one morning and watched the sun strike the frozen ground. The light did nothing to warm it yet, but it promised change. Around her, the hill remained solid, patient, unchanged. It had done exactly what she had trusted it to do. Winter had tested everyone equally. The difference was that she had built something that understood winter long before it arrived. The change did not happen all at once. It began quietly, in small, uncomfortable realizations that followed people back into their failing homes. After visiting the dugout, after feeling warmth that did not flicker or flee, it became impossible to ignore the contrast. Once the body learns a truth, the mind struggles to deny it. People return to their frame houses carrying more than cold with them. They carried doubt. At first they spoke cautiously. No one wanted to be the first to admit they had been wrong. Pride had built those houses as much as timber had. To question them felt like questioning years of certainty, of inherited knowledge passed down without challenge. But winter had a way of stripping away illusion. It did not care about tradition. It cared only about physics, weight, and time. Fires continued to burn day and night across the town, yet the warmth never seemed to settle. Heat rushed upward and vanished into the cold sky. Wind clawed at walls relentlessly, prying into every seam. People woke stiff and aching, exhaustion layered over chill that refused to leave their bones. Woodpiles shrank at a frightening pace. Calculations were made in whispers. How many days of fuel remained, how much colder it might still get. Against that backdrop, the hillside stood calm. Those who had stepped inside the dugout found themselves replaying the sensation in their minds, the way the air felt dense, but not stale, the absence of drafts, the steady temperature that did not demand constant attention. They remembered how their shoulders had relaxed without conscious effort, how breathing had slowed naturally. It unsettled them because it revealed how much effort they had been spending just to exist inside their own homes. The questions began soon after, not shouted across the street or announced publicly, but asked quietly, often at the edge of embarrassment. People approached her when others weren't listening. They asked how deep the walls were, how thick the earth lay above the ceiling. They asked how often she fed the stove, how much wood she burned in a day. Each answer surprised them. The numbers did not align with what they believed possible. She answered patiently, without satisfaction or resentment. There was no point in saying "I told you so." Winter had already said it far more clearly than she ever could. As the days passed, visitors became more frequent. Some came simply to warm their hands for a few minutes, their faces softening the moment they crossed the threshold. Others came with notebooks and measuring sticks, tracing the walls with their eyes, trying to understand how something so simple could outperform everything they had built. A few came only to stand in silence, absorbing the truth without words. The dugout became a reference point, not as a refuge for the entire town, but as proof that another way existed. Above ground, the damage accumulated. Boards warped permanently. Cracks widened. Ice lingered in places where it had no business being. Even when the temperature rose slightly, the houses did not recover. They had been stressed beyond what they were meant to endure. Repairs were temporary at best, futile at worst. People began talking openly now. Not about her foolishness, but about their own mistakes. They admitted how much heat escaped through roofs and floors, how little protection empty space beneath raised houses actually provided, how wind, once given access, never stopped taking. These conversations would have been unthinkable before winter arrived. Now they happened daily, driven by experience rather than theory. Someone suggested digging deeper foundations next year. Someone else mentioned partially earth-sheltered storage. A third person wondered aloud why houses had ever been lifted so far above ground in a place where cold ruled most of the year. Each idea chipped away at old certainty. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she spoke plainly. She explained that earth did not resist heat, it moderated it. That depth mattered more than decoration. That wind was the real enemy, not snow. She described how the hill absorbed warmth during the day and returned it slowly at night. How mass mattered more than thickness of boards. None of it was mystical or secret. It was simply ignored before. What surprised her most was not that people listened, but how carefully they listened. Winter had humbled them. It had taught them to value results over reputation. Some asked if she would help them plan changes. She agreed, cautiously. Not because she wanted recognition, but because she understood what it meant to face another winter unprepared. She walked hillsides with them, pointing out slopes that broke wind naturally, soil that packed well, places where snow drifted predictably. She showed them how to read the land the way she had learned to do, slowly, patiently, without assumptions. She did not tell them to abandon frame houses entirely. Not everyone was ready for that. Instead, she suggested compromises, deeper walls, lower ceilings, earth berms piled against exposed sides, entrances turned away from prevailing winds. Simple changes that made a measurable difference. As word spread, the tone of the town shifted completely. Where mockery once lived, curiosity now thrived. People who had laughed the loudest were among the quietest now, their questions careful, their attention focused. No one apologized outright. They didn't need to. Their behavior said enough. The cold lingered longer than anyone wanted. Night still dropped hard, but something had changed. People stopped panicking. They adapted. They learned where to reinforce, where to conserve, where to stop wasting effort. The dugout did not just shelter one person. It rewired how the town understood winter itself. Children noticed it too. They stopped daring each other to run past the hillside. Instead, they asked questions. They touched the earth walls with curiosity rather than fear. They listened when adults explained why the inside stayed warm. Seeds of understanding were planted quietly, without ceremony. When the first real thaw finally came, it did not feel like victory. It felt like survival. The town emerged altered, tired, and more honest than it had been before. Repairs began immediately. Some houses were patched. Others were quietly dismantled, their materials ved for something new. And on the hillsides beyond the town, stakes appeared. Not all at once, but enough to notice. Measurements were taken. Earth was tested. People who had once believed height equaled strength now measured depth instead. The ground, once dismissed as obstacle, became resource. She watched it all with calm detachment. Her dugout remained unchanged. It did not need repairs. It did not need celebration. It had done exactly what it was meant to do. Nothing more, nothing less. While others rebuilt, she maintained, adjusting only small details learned through experience. When people thanked her, she accepted quietly. When they asked why she hadn't tried harder to convince them earlier, she answered honestly. Because they wouldn't have listened. Because winter teaches better than words ever can. By the time the land softened fully and snow retreated into memory, the town no longer laughed at hills or caves or earth. They had learned, the hard way, that survival did not belong to tradition or pride. It belonged to those willing to observe, adapt, and trust what the world had already proven for thousands of years. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew the same thing. The hill had saved her first, but her choice had saved them all. Spring did not arrive suddenly. It approached the way it always did in that land, slowly, cautiously, as if unsure it was welcome. The snow lingered in the shadows long after the sun grew stronger, and the ground stayed hard beneath the surface even as days lengthened. But the worst of winter had released its grip. What remained was the reckoning. The town carried scars now. Houses leaned slightly where foundations had shifted. Boards bore long, pale cracks that no amount of patching could fully erase. Chimneys stood blackened from months of overuse. Wood piles were gone, reduced to stumps and splinters. Memories of warmth burned too quickly and too desperately. People moved more slowly, not just from fatigue, but from reflection. They had survived, but survival had come at a cost they would not forget. The dugout in the hillside stood exactly as it had before. Rain fell softly one afternoon, seeping into the thawing earth, and people watched instinctively for signs of collapse. None came. The hill absorbed the water the way it absorbed cold, holding it, redistributing it, remaining stable and patient. The entrance stayed dry. The walls stayed firm. Nothing shifted. That quiet resilience unsettled some and comforted others. It became impossible to see the dugout as strange anymore. It was simply right. As repairs began across town, people worked with new awareness. They no longer trusted appearance. They tested things. They pressed on walls, checked seams, studied how water moved after rain. They argued less about tradition and more about results. Winter had stripped their confidence down to something raw and useful. Some frame houses were repaired carefully, reinforced with changes inspired by what they had learned. Ceilings were lowered, floors insulated properly. Earth was piled against exposed walls to block wind. Entrances were rebuilt facing away from prevailing storms. These houses would survive better next time. Others, however, were quietly abandoned. Those families chose the hills. At first it was just storage, root cellars dug deeper than before, partially buried sheds for food into holes. Then came something bolder, dugouts. Not crude holes, but deliberate shelters shaped with care. People worked together now, sharing labor instead of ridicule. They remembered how alone she had been when she began, and no one wanted to repeat that mistake. She was asked to advise, not command. And she did. She walked with them across slopes and valleys, pointing out where the land curved naturally, where snow drifted gently instead of piling dangerously, where water ran off instead of pooling. She explained why depth mattered more than thickness, why mass defeated cold better than constant heat. She showed them how to seal with clay, how to let the earth do the work instead of fighting it. She never insisted. She suggested. She let people learn through their own hands, their own measurements, their own quiet moments of realization. That mattered more than instruction. As summer approached, the town looked different. Less proud, perhaps, but wiser. The hills bore the first signs of change: low doorways, reinforced frames, careful excavation. Children played near them without fear. To them, the idea that a home could exist partly underground felt natural, even obvious. The old jokes vanished completely. No one mentioned caves or animals anymore. They spoke instead of insulation, of wind protection, of stored heat. Words changed. And when words change, so does thinking. Through it all, her dugout remained largely untouched. She maintained it the way one maintains something trusted, checking seals, smoothing walls, making small improvements learned through lived experience. She added shelves. She adjusted the stove's position by inches, refining airflow and heat storage. E observed how the interior responded to seasonal changes, noting what worked and what could be better. The dugout was not static. It evolved quietly, just as she did. People occasionally asked if she would build something above ground now that winter had passed. She always smiled at that. Why would she? The dugout was cool in summer, the earth absorbing heat instead of amplifying it. While frame houses baked under the sun, hers stayed comfortable, shaded, calm. She needed no extra effort to stay at ease. The hill protected her year-round. As years passed, winter returned as it always did, but it never ruled the town the same way again. Houses held warmth better. Woodpiles lasted longer. Panic never quite took hold. People remembered what failure felt like and prepared accordingly. And always the dugout stood as a quiet reminder, not of cleverness, but of humility. It taught a lesson no one forgot. Survival is not about domination, it is about alignment. The land is not something to conquer or ignore. It is something to work with. Something that will give generously if respected. She aged, as everyone does, but the dugout aged differently. Earth does not wrinkle or weaken the way wood does. It settled. It strengthened. Each passing year pressed it more firmly into place. The hill and the home became inseparable, one shaping the other. Newcomers to the town heard the story eventually, not as a legend filled with exaggeration, but as a matter-of-fact account of a hard winter and a smarter choice. The story was told plainly, almost casually, the way truths are told once they no longer need defending. They would ask to see it, and when they stepped inside years later, Till felt it. The steady air, the calm temperature, the quiet that wrapped around them like a promise. The dugout did not impress with beauty or size. It impressed with certainty. She never sought credit. She never needed it. The earth had been her partner, not her project. It had done most of the work long before she arrived. When she was gone, the dugout remained. Others used it, learned from it, passed by it daily without a second thought. That was the final proof of success, not admiration but normalcy. What was once mocked had become simply another way to live. And every winter, when the wind howled across the open ground and the cold pressed down hard, the hills answered the same way they always had, by holding,